In the heart of London stands an ancient fortress whose very stones seem to echo with whispers of power, betrayal, and blood. The Tower of London, a place where the past never truly sleeps. Today visitors walk its cold corridors and peer into its damp cells, but 5 centuries ago these walls held secrets so dark they still cast a shadow over the British monarchy. This is the story of 2 young princes, heirs to the English throne, children who vanished without a trace in one of history's most chilling mysteries. Were they victims of ambition, pawns in a deadly game, or survivors whose fate was twisted into legend? To understand their disappearance, we must step back into the year 1483, into the very heart of England's bloody power struggle, and into the Tower of London itself. The late 15th century was not the proud, unified kingdom we imagine today. It was a land fractured by decades of civil war, a brutal struggle for the crown known as the Wars of the Roses. On one side, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by a red rose. On the other, the House of York, marked by a white one. These rival branches of the royal Plantagenet dynasty fought not only with armies but with whispers, plots, and betrayals. Kings were crowned and toppled, fortunes made and lost, and heads quite literally rolled. Into this maelstrom of shifting power rose Edward IV, a tall, charismatic, and ruthless warrior king from the House of York. He seized the throne in 1461, deposing the Lancastrian King Henry VI. His reign would be marked by both triumph and controversy. Edward was a soldier and a statesman, but he was also a man of impulsive passions. He married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and widow, without consulting his advisors, a union that shocked the nobility and unleashed a wave of resentment against the upstart Woodville family who suddenly rose to power at court. For nearly 2 decades Edward held the kingdom in his grip. But in 1483, at the age of just 40, he died suddenly, some whisper by illness, others by poison, leaving behind a fragile legacy and 2 young sons. The elder boy, Prince Edward, was only 12. The younger, Prince Richard, just 9. Both were still children, innocent perhaps but caught in the deadly currents of royal succession. By law and tradition, Edward, the elder, was now King Edward V, though he had never been crowned. As custom demanded, his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, brother to the late king, was named Lord Protector, the guardian of the realm until the boy came of age. It should have been a simple, temporary arrangement. But in the world of medieval monarchy, power once tasted was seldom surrendered, and the stage was set for one of England's darkest tales. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was no stranger to war or politics. Born in 1452, the youngest son of Richard, Duke of York, he had spent his youth in the shadow of his larger-than-life brother Edward. Yet Richard carved his own reputation as a loyal general, a shrewd administrator, and to many, a man of integrity. Unlike his flamboyant brother, Richard lived simply. He was known for his piety, his discipline, and his sense of duty. But even Richard had his ambitions. He had been granted vast lands in the north of England, making him a kind of semi-independent lord there. He was a man used to command, to influence, and to being trusted by his brother the king. And now, with Edward dead, Richard stood at a crossroads: protect his young nephew and ensure the Woodvilles did not dominate the throne, or seize power for himself. To his supporters, Richard was a stabilizing force, a loyal uncle determined to protect the crown from greedy hands. To his enemies, he was a cunning usurper, a man who would stop at nothing to be king. In April 1483, news of Edward's death rippled across England. Edward V was at Ludlow, under the care of his Woodville relatives, while Richard was in Yorkshire. Almost immediately the late king's widow, Elizabeth Woodville, and her powerful family moved to control the boy king's person and the regency government. But Richard acted swiftly. With a small army, he intercepted Edward's retinue at Stony Stratford on April 30th, arresting key Woodville leaders including the boy's half-brother Sir Richard Grey and his uncle Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. Richard then escorted his nephew, the new king, to London under his protection. Elizabeth Woodville, alarmed by this sudden move, fled with her younger son, Prince Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, a sacred refuge beyond the reach of the law. There she waited, terrified and uncertain. On May 4th, Edward entered London. Officially, Richard of Gloucester was still his protector, but the balance of power had shifted. Edward was no longer surrounded by his mother's allies but by his uncle's loyal men. In the 15th century, the Tower of London was not merely a prison. It was also a royal residence and a fortress, often used to prepare monarchs for coronation. Thus, when Edward V was placed there in May 1483, it could be presented as tradition, not captivity. The boy's coronation was set for June 22nd. Meanwhile, Richard tightened his grip on the government, removing more Woodville loyalists and placing his supporters in key positions. In mid-June, Richard made a bold move. He demanded that Elizabeth surrender her younger son so that the boy could join his brother in the Tower for his safety. After some hesitation, the Queen complied. On June 16, the Duke of York left sanctuary and entered the Tower, reunited with his elder brother. Now both princes, the heirs of Edward IV, were in their uncle's custody. At first, Londoners still expected the coronation. But rumors began to swirl. Whispers that the boys were illegitimate. That Edward IV had been secretly married before Elizabeth Woodville, making all his children bastards. On June 22, instead of crowning Edward V, a preacher named Ralph Shaw publicly declared the two princes illegitimate. Days later, a petition was presented to Richard of Gloucester urging him to take the throne. On July 6, 1483, Richard was crowned King Richard III of England. At first, after Richard's coronation, the boys were still seen occasionally at the windows and gardens of the Tower. Chroniclers noted their presence as late as the summer of 1483, but gradually sightings stopped. The young king and his brother simply disappeared from public view. By the autumn, the rumors had hardened. The princes were dead, people whispered, smothered in their sleep or drowned or poisoned. Some said Richard had ordered their deaths. Others suggested the Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's ally, had acted on his own. Still others believed the boys had been spirited away in secret to live under new identities. But no bodies were produced. No public announcement was made. And the mystery began. Richard's reign was troubled from the start. Though he worked to stabilize the kingdom, reforming the courts, enforcing the law and protecting merchants, the stain of the prince's disappearance clung to him. Rebels rose up, citing his alleged murder of his nephews as a rallying cry. The most dangerous of these rebels was Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant living in exile in France. In 1485, just 2 years after Richard's coronation, Henry invaded England, defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field and took the crown as Henry VII. Richard III was killed on the battlefield, the last English king to die in combat. Henry's victory ended the Wars of the Roses and began the Tudor dynasty. He married Elizabeth of York, eldest sister of the missing princes, uniting the warring houses. But the fate of the two boys remained unresolved. Even as Henry consolidated power, rumors persisted. Pretenders appeared, claiming to be one of the lost princes. Chroniclers debated who killed them. And the Tower of London became not just a fortress but a symbol, a monument to royal ambition and the price of power. More than 500 years later, we still ask the same questions. Who killed the princes in the Tower? Were they victims of their uncle or pawns in a larger game? And what secrets still lie beneath the stones of the Tower? London in the summer of 1483 was a city heavy with rumor. Inside the Tower, two boys had vanished from public life, but outside, in taverns and markets and in the Great Hall of Westminster itself, whispers spread like fire. Who had silenced the heirs of Edward IV? In a world where power was measured not in laws but in blood, ambition could be a death sentence. Yet even then no one knew the truth. The silence from the Tower was complete. The new king, Richard III, issued no proclamation about his nephews. He did not display them, he did not announce their safety, he simply let them fade from view. That silence became an accusation all its own. Chroniclers began to write of a dark deed done in secret, of children smothered in their beds, of orders whispered in the dead of night. But who gave those orders, if indeed a murder had taken place, was a question with many possible answers. Richard himself has always stood at the center of suspicion. He alone had custody of the boys. He alone benefited most directly from their disappearance. The bastardy declaration stripped them of their legal claim, but as long as they were alive they remained dangerous symbols for rebellion. For centuries historians painted Richard as a hunchbacked villain, a twisted usurper whose ambition knew no bounds. This image, immortalized by Shakespeare, became part of England's cultural memory. Yet the man himself was more complicated. In the north he had governed justly, he had a reputation for fairness in the courts, he punished corrupt officials, and he inspired loyalty among commoners. His contemporaries did not always see a monster, they saw a prince with both virtues and vices. If he did order the deaths, it was not out of sadism but out of cold calculation. Eliminating the princes would secure his throne. Allowing them to live would leave a rallying point for his enemies. In the brutal logic of medieval politics, it was a choice many might have made. Yet Richard was not the only man with motive. Another figure looms large in the shadows of this mystery: Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. Once Richard's ally, Buckingham had helped orchestrate the coup against the Woodvilles. But by the autumn of 1483 he had turned against the king, leading a rebellion that invoked the names of the princes as martyrs. Some have speculated that Buckingham, ambitious and ruthless, might have arranged their deaths without Richard's knowledge, either to place himself in a position of greater power or to blacken Richard's name. He too had access to the tower. He too had reason to remove the boys. His rebellion failed and he was executed, but the question of his role lingers. Others cast suspicion on agents of Henry Tudor. Though Tudor was still in exile, his supporters were active in England. Killing the princes and blaming Richard would weaken the king's legitimacy and clear the path for Henry's eventual claim. The irony of this theory is stark. Henry would later marry the prince's own sister, Elizabeth of York, binding Yorkist blood to the Tudor crown. If his faction had indeed arranged their deaths, history's final twist is cruel. And then there is another, quieter possibility. That no murder happened at all. That the princes were smuggled out of the tower and hidden, perhaps with the knowledge of their mother, perhaps by secret sympathizers within the court. Over the years pretenders emerged claiming to be one of the lost boys. The most famous of these was Perkin Warbeck, who in the 1490s declared himself to be Richard, Duke of York. He gained powerful backers, led invasions and nearly toppled Henry VII. Eventually he was captured and executed, but to his last breath he insisted on his royal identity. Was he an impostor or the real prince grown to manhood? The question fascinated Europe at the time and still provokes debate. What we know for certain is painfully little. The princes were last seen alive in the late summer of 1483. After that, no contemporary chronicler reports seeing them. In 1674, nearly 200 years later, workmen renovating the Tower of London discovered a wooden box beneath a staircase in the White Tower. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children. Charles II ordered them interred in Westminster Abbey in an urn inscribed with their presumed identity as the lost princes. In 1933 the bones were examined by medical experts who concluded they were consistent with the ages of Edward and Richard at the time of their disappearance. But the science of the day was limited. No DNA analysis was possible. Even the age estimation was rough. The urn remains sealed and requests to re-examine the remains using modern methods have been denied. The mystery endures, sealed as tightly as the stone vault that holds the bones. Other pieces of evidence are equally elusive. Thomas More, the statesman who would later be executed by Henry VIII, wrote a vivid account of the murders in the early 16th century. According to More, Richard ordered 2 men, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, to smother the boys with pillows in their chamber and bury them under a staircase. It was a compelling story and Shakespeare drew heavily on it. Yet More was only a child when the events happened, writing decades later under a Tudor king eager to vilify Richard. His account may be a mixture of rumor, propaganda and guesswork. Similarly, foreign ambassadors reported what they heard in the gossip of court but offered no proof. Chronicles from Burgundy, France and Italy echo the same theme, that the princes were murdered, but none offer first-hand testimony. We are left then with a crime without a body, a case without a witness, a verdict rendered by rumor. In such a vacuum theories multiply. Some imagine secret plots within secret plots. Some see the hand of fate. Others insist we are misreading the evidence entirely. Perhaps the boys died of illness as children often did, and their uncle concealed it for political reasons. Perhaps they lived, hidden under assumed names, their identities known only to a handful of confidants. So, they were never revealed. No credible adult emerged to claim their legacy. No deathbed confession solved the puzzle. 5 centuries later the tower still keeps its secret. Even the building itself has become part of the legend. Visitors stand in the bloody tower, said to be the prince's lodging, and imagine the muffled footsteps of assassins. They gaze at the staircase under which the bones were found and shiver. Guides tell the story with a shudder, their voices echoing in the ancient halls. Yet the tower has housed many prisoners, many deaths, many burials. Bones unearthed there could belong to anyone from the long centuries of its use. The aura of mystery may be as much a creation of our own fascination with royal tragedy as of any hidden truth. And still the story holds power. It is the archetype of innocence destroyed by ambition, of the vulnerable devoured by the ruthless. It has inspired painters, poets, playwrights and novelists. It has shaped the image of Richard III as a villain and colored the reputation of the monarchy itself. In a sense the princes never disappeared at all. They live on as symbols, as questions, as ghosts haunting English history. Every time a researcher petitions to examine the urn in Westminster Abbey, every time a historian revisits the chronicles, every time a dramatist writes a new version of the tale, the boys return to life for a moment in our collective imagination. To tell their story is to enter a labyrinth where fact and legend intertwine. We can trace the movements of armies, the dates of coronations, the text of proclamations. We can name the players, describe their motives, weigh the evidence. But at the center of the labyrinth, in a locked chamber of the tower, two children vanish, and history stands silent. That silence has lasted for over 500 years. It may last forever. Or perhaps, somewhere in the dusty archives of England, or in the sealed vaults of the Abbey, or in the soil beneath the tower, a clue waits to be found that will at last tell us what happened on those summer nights of 1483 when two princes stepped into the shadow of the crown and were never seen again. In the years after the Battle of Bosworth Field, a new dynasty ruled England. Henry VII wore the crown that Richard III had lost, and with it he inherited a kingdom still murmuring about the vanished princes. Officially, the Tudor court said little. It was convenient to let the story stand as proof of Richard's villainy. It made Henry's victory appear as justice delivered from heaven. Yet the silence about the prince's actual fate remained. Henry married Elizabeth of York, the missing boy's elder sister, and with that marriage he joined the blood of York and Lancaster, healing a war that had torn England apart for decades. But even as he produced heirs and consolidated power, the ghosts of his brothers-in-law haunted his throne. In 1487, a boy named Lambert Simnel was put forward by Yorkist rebels as Edward, Earl of Warwick, a different nephew of Edward IV who was also a potential claimant. Simnel was quickly captured, paraded as a kitchen servant and given a job in the royal kitchens. That imposture was brief and almost comical. But a few years later a far more dangerous claimant appeared, a young man named Perkin Warbeck. He claimed not to be Warwick but Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two lost princes. His story was elaborate. He said he had escaped from the tower with the help of loyal friends, lived in hiding and then in exile abroad, and now returned to reclaim his birthright. Across Europe, courts received him as royalty. Margaret of Burgundy, the sister of Edward IV, recognized him as her nephew. He gained the backing of powerful nobles, launched invasions, and for a time seriously threatened Henry's rule. When he was finally captured in 1497, Henry made him confess publicly that he was an impostor, the son of a Flemish boatman. But even on the scaffold at Tyburn 2 years later, he refused to retract his claim. To his last breath he called himself Richard of England. Was he a fraud, a puppet of foreign powers, or truly one of the lost boys returned as a man? We cannot know. His blood vanished into the soil of London along with his secret. The Tudors used his defeat to cement their narrative. Richard III was the villain, the princes his victims, and Henry VII the savior of the realm. This story was repeated by chroniclers and refined by Thomas More, who gave the vivid description of the murders that Shakespeare would later transform into a mortal drama. In the Elizabethan theater, Richard became the crooked monster, sneering and plotting as he ordered the smothering of his nephews. Audiences thrilled to the villainy. The image endured for centuries, shaping the collective memory of England. Yet historians who look beyond the propaganda see a more ambiguous figure, a capable ruler tainted by suspicion, a man perhaps guilty, perhaps not, but certainly defeated by the tide of history. Even the discovery of the bones in 1674 did not end the debate. When workmen at the tower unearthed the small skeletons under a staircase, Charles II ordered them placed reverently in an urn and interred in Westminster Abbey near the tomb of their presumed grandfather. The urn bears an inscription identifying them as Edward and Richard, but no proof was offered. In 1933, medical experts opened the urn and examined the remains. They concluded they were the bones of two children roughly the right age. But their report was cautious. The remains were mixed with animal bones, they had been moved, they were incomplete. They could be the princes, they could be other children who died in the tower during its long history. Modern science could in theory solve the puzzle. DNA from the bones could be compared to known descendants of the royal line. Yet the Abbey has repeatedly refused requests to reopen the urn. For now the question stays locked with the bones. Other clues have surfaced only to fade again. In 1789, workers repairing St. George's Chapel at Windsor found a small coffin near the tomb of Edward IV. It contained the bones of a child. Some speculated that one prince had been buried there secretly while the other remained in the tower. The coffin was lost again during further work. Its contents were never tested. In the 20th and 21st centuries, amateur historians and professional scholars alike have proposed new theories, scoured archives, and published books, each claiming to have found the final answer. But the final answer remains out of reach. Meanwhile, Richard III himself underwent a strange resurrection. In 2012, archaeologists in Leicester uncovered a skeleton beneath a car park. DNA confirmed it was Richard, lost for over 500 years. His spine was curved with scoliosis but not grotesquely hunched as legend said. His body showed battle wounds but no sign of monstrous deformity. In 2015 he was reburied with honor in Leicester Cathedral. His rediscovery renewed interest in his life and reign. It also reignited debate about the princes. Some argued that a man capable of such legal reforms and such loyalty could not have murdered his nephews. Others replied that even good rulers can commit terrible crimes when power is at stake. Richard's bones tell us how he lived and died, but they tell us nothing of what happened in the tower. And so the mystery survives. It survives in the footsteps of tourists who wander the bloody tower imagining the two boys at play. It survives in the dusty pages of chronicles, in the portraits of pale children with solemn eyes, in the lines of Shakespeare spoken on stages around the world. It survives because it speaks to something deeper than a political murder. It speaks to the fear of innocence destroyed by ambition, to the darkness that can lurk behind ceremony and crowns, to the fragility of legitimacy and the cost of power. In the prince's story, every age sees its own reflection. Victorians saw a moral tale of wicked uncles. 20th century readers saw a crime mystery to be solved by evidence. Today we see a psychological drama of trauma, propaganda, and contested memory. Perhaps that is why the prince's fate may never be proven. Even if the urn in Westminster Abbey were opened tomorrow, even if DNA showed beyond doubt that the bones belonged to Edward and Richard, even if forensic science determined how they died, there would still be room for doubt. Who gave the order? What truly happened? Did they suffer? Did they escape? Did they live under assumed names in some distant corner of England? History leaves us no confession, no eyewitness, no smoking pillow. It leaves us only two children stepping into the tower on a summer's day in 1483 and vanishing from the record. From that moment on we walk in darkness. And yet there is one more way in which they live. Every telling of their story gives them a kind of immortality. Each time a guide at the tower gestures to the window where they were last seen, each time a reader turns the pages of a book about them, each time a voice like mine speaks their names into the air, Edward and Richard walk again through the corridors of history. They are no longer just victims or pawns or ghosts. They are questions, and questions are harder to bury than bodies. So we end where we began, at the Tower of London, its stones wet with rain, its ravens watching, its battlements sharp against a grey English sky. Within these walls kings were crowned, traitors were beheaded, queens were imprisoned, and two boys disappeared. More than 500 years later their story still reaches across time. It asks us to look at power and innocence, at ambition and loyalty, at the stories we tell about the past. And it whispers a challenge. Some truths may be hidden for centuries, but they are never wholly lost. Somewhere beneath the stones, in the archives, in our imaginations, the princes wait, not for a throne but for an answer.